Good evening to all of you. I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to this plenary session of the first day of this conference. It has been a fascinating discussion on a rather difficult time when the whole world and of course India itself is battling with the pandemic. The theme of this session is getting policies right for an inclusive growth. We have with us a very distinguished lawyer, a politician, and indeed a public intellectual, Mr. Manish Tewari. I would like to welcome all of you to this first plenary session of this conference. Now, achieving inclusive growth has been a continuous economic policy challenge for developing countries like India, despite India's economic and social growth for the last 75 years. The COVID-19 pandemic has been one of the most unprecedented crises of our time, a black swan moment, and it has only further exposed the underlying inequalities and vulnerabilities in our own society. The call for an inclusive and resilient economy is thus more important than ever, and it needs to be emphasized at every opportunity available, and this conference was just one more platform for the same. We have a very special guest with us here today, Mr. Manish Tewari, to deliver a keynote address on getting policies right for an inclusive growth. A very warm welcome to you, Mr. Tewari. Thank you very much for being here with us in this conference organized by O.P. Jindal Global University in collaboration with CUTS International. A distinguished lawyer by training and having practiced in the Supreme Court of India, Mr. Tewari is a lawyer turned politician and was elected as a member of parliament from Ludhiana of Punjab state as member of Indian National Congress in 2009. He started his political career with the National Students' Union of India and later became a member of Congress Party's National Committee. He also served as Union Minister of State Independent Charge, Information and Broadcasting from 2009 to 2014. Mr. Tewari did also join a US-based think tank as a distinguished fellow in 2017 at the South Asia Center of the Atlantic Council and also served as a spokesperson for Congress. We are deeply grateful that he could join us today to discuss a very important area of policymaking for making our future more inclusive. Therefore, without further ado, I would now call upon Mr. Manish Tewari for delivering his keynote address. I'm also grateful to my colleague, Professor Dr. Srijit, who will be chairing and moderating this session. Over to you, Mr. Tewari.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajkumar, Professor Srijit. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, allow me to thank the Jindal Global University and CUTS International for organizing this very timely conference on the economic dimensions of judicial decisions and inviting me to deliver this keynote on getting policies right for the future. We meet in rather interesting times, if I may say, apocalyptic times. The second wave of the coronavirus has completely overwhelmed us. It's not as if it wasn't expected. All historical, empirical, scientific evidence points towards the fact that the second wave of any pandemic is unfortunately more lethal than the first one. We just took our eyes off the ball. And unfortunately, a lot of helpless, innocent citizens are paying the price for that negligence. And if I may say, criminally culpable negligence. India's caseload on the 27th of April stands at 1.73 crore cases. The good news is that the recovery has also been fairly rapid. 1.43 crore people recovered or have recovered. Unfortunately, 1,95,000 were lost to the pandemic. But what is worrying as of today is that we are on an average, on a weekly average, adding about 321,000 cases daily to the viral caseload, and that unfortunately is completely overwhelming our systems. What do we have on the ground? We have a situation where only about 2.4 crore of our people out of 135 crores have been fully vaccinated. This accounts for just 1.6% of the population of this country. On the other hand, we have, in the past 3 months, exported 6.63 crore doses of vaccines as of today morning. These vaccines, if they would have been domestically used, would have easily fully vaccinated another 3.31 crore people. And that's a lot of people. The reason why I am flagging these numbers at this point in time, because if you were to juxtapose this against the approach adopted by the United States of America and many other European nations, they have decided to prioritize their own citizens first. In fact, the United States of America, the spokesperson for the State Department, went so far as to say that our first obligation is to vaccinate Americans first. And so therefore, this brings us to the fundamental policy question that in times like these, should India have indulged in this vaccine maitri or vaccine diplomacy or whatever else you would like to call it, or we should have prioritized our own citizens first, given that when the rollout of the vaccine started, the first signs of the second wave had already started manifesting themselves. I would like all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to seriously apply yourself to this question, because this is where the story of our misplaced priorities unfortunately starts. And this has been the endemic problem now going back over second decades. Number two, let me just step back 4 decades and take you back to 1976. Why is 1976 important? 1976 is important because that's when the reign of Mao Zedong, the great helmsman, ended in China. It had been a disastrous reign. Undoubtedly, Mao Zedong was responsible for creating the modern Chinese state in 1949. But then the various experiments that he undertook, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, had completely and absolutely devastated China by the time Mao's life finally ebbed away in 1976. In fact, during the last years of his tenure, China was effectively ruled by the Gang of Four, which they eventually had to then face the consequences of that misdirection of Chinese policies. So what was the situation in 1976? China's GDP in 1976 was $149.54 billion. Its per capita GDP was $156 US, and its GDP growth rate was 11.33%. Now, this is a misleading figure, and I would come to it in a moment. And where was India at that point in time? India had a total GDP of 137.30 billion USD. Its per capita GDP was $206 US, more than China, almost 57 US dollars more than China. And its growth of GDP in that particular year was 5.71%. Now, these GDP growth rates are misleading, and I'm sorry, these figures are 1978 and not 1976. But if you were to step back to 1976, both India and China start from a very low base. China was at minus 1.57 in terms of GDP growth, and India was only at 1.66% in terms of GDP growth. Today, 4 decades later, China's GDP is $16 trillion. And India is at $2.83 trillion. So obviously, the Chinese got something right. which we didn't. And what is it that the Chinese got right, and notwithstanding the current antagonism and the border standoff, there are certain takeaways that we as a nation need to internalize, because in terms of size and demographics, there's nothing which really compares with China when you were to try and juxtapose certain examples or take some examples for the Indian growth story. And what China got right was that it stabilized its population. The second thing which China got right was that it was very, very cognizant and conscious of the fact that it needed 30 years of peace on its periphery in order to consolidate, in order to surmount its internal economic and human development challenges. And so therefore, if you were to look at where the population of China was at 93.7 crores in 1976. In 2021, they're at 139.77 crores. India was at 63.76 crores. And in 2021, we are almost catching up with China, and we are at 136.64 crores. Unfortunately, because of the emergency, the population debate completely went off the table. And nobody in the policy space, politicians, academicians, even scientists, were willing to touch this with a barge pole. And unfortunately, a myth was created, the myth of a demographic dividend, that this burgeoning young population is a huge demographic dividend waiting to be harvested. Now, nothing could have been a bigger lie, because what we are currently facing in terms of overwhelmed hospitals, in terms of absence of hospital beds, in terms of absence of ventilators, in terms of absence of basic physical infrastructure for a dignified living, is primarily because our numbers overwhelm our growth story completely. India occupies 2.4% of the world area, and we are a home to 133 crore people. China occupies 2.6%, or 2.5%, occupies 6.3% of the world area, almost 2.5 times India's size, and they are at 136 crores, at 139 crores. So therefore, the first and the foremost thing which India needs to do is to bring the population question absolutely center stage. There, we need to shed our inhibitions, that we have to address the population issue. We need to bring our replacement rate down to negative. Otherwise, we really don't have a hope in hell. And we need to surmount this spurious debate of a demographic dividend, which has been a big cover-up for our failure to address this central question. The second thing is that India is not an emerging great power. India is still struggling in order to cope with the fundamentals of economic and human development of our people. And we need to be upfront and straight with our people about it. We need 30 years of peace on our periphery in order to be able to concentrate on our internal challenges. These myths which are propagated by retired foreign office types or people in the strategic establishment, that India's moment in the sun has come. I'm afraid India's moment in the sun will only come when we are able to put all our children into school, when we are able to provide basic healthcare to our people, when we are able to ensure that the bulk of our populace is insured, when we are able to give proper healthcare to our people, and not people dying because of lack of oxygen in our hospitals. It's time to get real. Yes, India's moment in the sun will come, but it will come maybe 3 or 4 decades down the road. If we very wisely decide not to hunker down, but to engage with the world in very exceptional terms, being absolutely clear as to what our priorities should be. With regard to India's economy, unfortunately, like China had a great healthman, we've also had a great healthman for the last 7 years. And there have been various experiments which have completely and absolutely gone awry. Demonetization was one of those experiments which completely devastated the informal economy of India. An ill-conceived and a hastily rolled out goods and services tax added to those woes. But most importantly, the government was not able to internalize one fundamental reality. And that one fundamental reality is that social disharmony and economic development do not go hand in hand. Money is the biggest coward, and money goes to the safest harbor. And today, because of all the discourse which has been splashed across the international press, love jihad, ghar wapsi, Beti Bachao, Bahu Le Aao, and every kind of retrogressive, polarizing activity, which unfortunately has been carried out on this government's watch, has sent out a message to investors across the world that India is not a safe harbor. And this is at a point in time when countries are actually looking to diversify from the dependence which they have on China in terms of global supply chains, all leading back to the factory of the world. And the manner in which China weaponized those supply chains over the past 1 year during the pandemic has a lot of people worried. But that the investment which is going out of China is going to Taiwan, it's going to Vietnam, it's going to Bangladesh. It is not coming to India. I mean, if you look at the empirical data that from 2016 onwards, the amount of money which has left China and as to which destinations it has gone to, India has not been one of those destinations. And the reason for that is the discourse about India in the international press, in the Financial Times, in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in the Le Monde, papers which investors globally read. The entire discourse has been completely negative because of an extremely corrosive social agenda. So therefore, if we want economic development, if we want India to grow at 8%, which is the minimum that we require in order to keep the body and soul of such a huge population together, we have to bring back social peace. And it is not something which is impossible. From 2004 to 14, following the mantra of equity with growth, the then UPA government actually lifted 271 million people, 27 crore out of poverty. Many of them who in the past 7 years have slid back into poverty. So therefore, the way forward for the Indian economy is to get the growth, equity, and social harmony balance absolutely correct, to get that equilibrium in order, and not large-scale privatization of our public assets. And nobody's arguing that they function in the most efficient manner. But that is not going to give us the 8% growth we require. We need to reignite, and we need to let loose the animal spirits of the economy and ensure that this atmosphere of coercion, intimidation, which has been created by the completely arbitrary and brazen use of the instrumentalities of the state, be it Income Tax Enforcement Directorate, the Central Bureau of Investigation, the NIA, this needs to stop, because otherwise money and people who have the ability of entrepreneurship are just going to flee this country in droves, as they have done from 2016 onwards. If I remember correctly, there was data from 2016, which I had seen some years back, that in that 1 year, 100,000 high net worth individuals from India actually became permanent residents in the UAE, most of them in Dubai. So therefore, to conclude, and I would be more than happy to take questions, that we stand on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, or in fact, not on the cusp, but maybe in the midst of the fourth industrial revolution, the digital age. And we have the unique ability, given the kind of infrastructure that we have built, to harness this digital age and actually provide and actually create wealth for our people. The question is that, would we be able to catch this bus, or will we miss this bus as we missed the first, second, and the third industrial revolutions? And so therefore, what I'm suggesting is not something which is rocket science. It is not a magic bullet. It has been tried and tested in the past. We just need to go back to that fundamental template, get our growth in order, bring population back center stage, and ensure that we create conditions in our neighborhood that we are able to have 30 years, 3 decades of peace on our periphery in order to concentrate and surmount our internal challenges. Thank you very much again, Professor Rajkumar, Professor Srijit, and to the Jindal Global University, the Cuts International, for having me in your midst. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tewari. That was a very enlightening discussion, and I'm very delighted to hear that informative and insightful lecture broadly touching the theme, getting policies right for inclusive future. Before we take the audience questions, I would just like to summarize this. This conference and your talk are quite timely and opportune, that the COVID-19 pandemic has prompted us to adopt a kind of economism at all levels in pursuit of optimal outcomes. The time has demanded us to become effective problem solvers, rational decision makers, and utility pursuers. There is no better guide than policy for those who aim for efficiency in the allocation of resources and optimality of outcomes. Hence, there has never been a time before when policy has the type of relevance as it has assumed it today. Ladies and gentlemen, our distinguished speaker, Mr. Manish Tewari, has focused on, through contemporary realities, on the role of policy in public space. Before we get into the audience, probably let me become one among them and start the Q&A. Mr. Tewari, could you enlighten us that probably in the light of the contemporary realities, the role policy can play in mapping scenarios, in estimating impacts, in predicting outcomes, in effectively responding to crisis, in decision-making, and largely in realizing smaller and larger social goals?
And thank you, Professor Srijit. That's a very, very profound question, and a very important question at this juncture. If I were to rewind back to 1918, when the First World War was winding down, and the Spanish flu, which of course had nothing to do with Spain, was raging across the world, people at that point in time, policymakers, were bereft of tools in order to either simulate or model or come to certain predictable conclusions on which they could base their responses. We have traveled very far down that road in the past 100 years. Science, technology, innovation, mathematical modeling, artificial intelligence, you name it, now gives us the ability to be able to map scenarios, predict with a reasonable degree of accuracy as to where we are headed, and then accordingly formulate and fashion responses. So under those circumstances, I think mapping, predicting a scenario building, and also figuring out a menu of responses to those scenarios is something which is possible today with a fair degree of accuracy, and which can be applied to a contemporary situation when it manifests itself, or a real life situation when it manifests itself. So under those circumstances, I am quite disappointed. In fact, I'm quite appalled that how could we have missed all the empirical evidence, the weight of history staring at us in our faces over the past 100 years, that a second wave is always more lethal. How could we have actually let our guard down? And I think on this particular question, there needs to be a very rigorous parliamentary scrutiny, perhaps even by a joint parliamentary committee, as to where did we as a system, and here I'm not trying to apportion responsibility or blame, as to how as a system, as a country, be it state governments, be it the central government, how did we completely take our eye off the ball?
We do. Thank you very much for that answer. We have received quite a few questions from the audience. I would request you to take one by one. So the first question is primarily about the role judiciary can play under these circumstances. How can economic policies which help to promote economic growth be better implemented through the judiciary? To what extent can law effectively play a role in enforcing policy decisions?
Well, obviously, the judicial system has an extremely important role, because most policies or their outcomes end up as legal challenges before different courts at different levels. But in my humble estimation, I have found the judiciary completely ill-equipped to be able to handle the complexity of both economic and administrative decision-making. And since the principal responsibility of the judiciary is to arbitrate about the justness or otherwise of government decisions, it is extremely important for judges to actually get a feel of what governance really is in India. And therefore, I am of the view that insofar as the subordinate judiciary is concerned, anybody who gets recruited to the subordinate judiciary must be seconded at least for a year to at the subdivisional level, at the district level, in order to see administration and action, in order to be able to understand their limitations and their excesses, on the ground. And this would really help them in coming to much better conclusions when it comes to deciding the arbitrariness or otherwise of administrative action which is taken. Similarly, with regard to judges who get directly elevated from the bar to the High Court, a similar process needs to be followed. At least for 1 year, they need to be trained at different levels of the bureaucracy at the tehsil level, at the district level, at the state, and at the central government level, at least for three months, so that it gives them an overview of how government at different levels functions. Number two, there has to be a certain amount of specialization which needs to be brought in, insofar as economic decision-making is concerned. Now, with great respect to the Supreme Court, the decision which was taken with regard to the cancellation of coal blocks going back all the way to 1992, I'm afraid, it did set the economy of the country back. Yes, if they wanted that coal block should be auctioned, could have been done prospectively if there was a certain amount of arbitrariness or rent seeking in a particular decision. Action should definitely have been taken. Similarly, with regard to spectrum, because eventually when the spectrum case went before the trial court, in order to in order to adjudicate the malfeasance of those who had taken those decisions, everybody ended up getting acquitted. The case fell flat on its face. But by then, the Supreme Court had already cancelled spectrum allocation and licenses. And so therefore, under those circumstances, there is a complete dichotomy, or if not dichotomy, a contradiction between decisions which the courts take, and eventually when their consequences in terms of either malfeasance or rent seeking or arbitrariness are tested before a trial court where you lead evidence as opposed to the appellate court, it does not stand on facts. And I think the basic problem there is that our judges, and with great respect to them, do not have an understanding, a ground level understanding of either the administrative or political reality of India.
Thank you. There is another interesting question, again, focusing on the judicial system. So how can adoption of technologies, including disruptive technologies, if at all, would help the judicial system become rational? In other words, can technologies like artificial intelligence help the court to adopt a super economistic approach towards problem solving?
Well, my view of technology, you may call it a little old-fashioned, is that technology is an enabler. Technology is not something which should replace the human being. You know, I know the maximum hiring over the past 2 years in the Silicon Valley has been of pure arts graduates from Brown University and some of the other pure liberal arts universities in the United States of America, primarily because they're trying to put the emotional quotient and the compassion quotient into artificial intelligence. But with great respect, I think the human mind is far better able to fathom the nuances and the complexities which are attendant and intrinsic to any Liz or any judicial proceeding. So I am all for adopting technology, technology which helps speed up things, smoothen things, straighten out the docket, do various other things. But in terms of judicial adjudication, I do not think that artificial intelligence or the robot should really be replacing the judge, howsoever unfortunately compliant the judicial system may have become, at least in certain respects these days.
Wonderful. So in the same vein, the balanced view you have taken towards the technology, we have an interesting question that the use of digital technologies, while leading to several benefits, have also resulted in claims related to exclusion of the desired beneficiaries, surveillance by states, abuse of power by the private sector, so on and so forth. How can the much desired balance be ensured in apparently conflicting economic interests of different stakeholders?
Well, you're absolutely correct. And I think the greatest example is in front of us. The greatest example of the digital divide is right in front of us. And children who come from poor, underprivileged or disempowered homes and who do not have the means of technology at their disposal have unfortunately not been able to access education or education facilities over the past 1 year as compared to their much better off peers. You see, if you go to rural India, and I represent a constituency which has 1,800 villages, which goes across 4 districts of Punjab. And the one thing which I ask the district education officers and other people very regularly at every meeting is, how are the poorer children faring that now that classes are not really happening? And the answer is that, we try and pool resources, etc., but it doesn't work. And so therefore, this is going to be the greatest challenge of the 4th industrial revolution, of the digital age. As technologies are going to replace human beings exceedingly. I mean, if you go by a World Bank estimate of 2018, if I'm correct, they say that automation is going to replace 67% of the workforce in the manufacturing sector. And that's in India. Other places, the numbers may be higher. So we have to look for a new economic model as to how do we then take care of all those people, productively utilize their energies, their potential, people who are going to be replaced by automation and digitization from the workforce. And I think enough thought has not been applied to this aspect by governments across the world. Certain progressive political parties in Europe have done some amount of work on this. But on the whole, the human consequences of the digital divide, of the fourth industrial age, is something which has not received the attention. And one day this will just hit us in the face. And so therefore, before the Panipat syndrome, as I call it, reoccurs, at least the Indian state needs to wake up, because given our demographics, we cannot have that disaster staring at us in the face.
Thank you for your observations on that. A slightly unrelated question, but still the question has a focus on the judiciary. So the questioner wants to know what institutional reforms can lead to the reduction of an overburdened judiciary. While the staggering pendency of the cases certainly is alarming for a statistician, the hard fact is that it's also affecting human lives. So how can actually the perspective be turned in a way that the human life comes on the focus when we analyze or when we address the question of the pendency of the cases before the courts?
You ask a very profound question. When I finished class 10th, my maternal grandfather, he was a lawyer and he was a politician. And so he took me to his club for a glass of beer. And he asked me, he says, what is it that you want to become? So I said, I want to become a lawyer. So he says, why do you want to become a lawyer? I said, because I like to argue. And he said something to me, which was very prophetic, and it has stuck with me since then. He says, do always keep in mind that in courts, decisions are handed down, not justice. अदालतों में फैसले होते हैं इंसाफ में. So therefore, the human aspect or the implications or the consequences of judicial decisions, delays on human life is something I think even as an academic discipline has not been looked at some great length. And in a country where you can possibly 2 generations can die before a matter gets decided, litigation is, if I may put it in those words, the luxury of the rich. Civil litigation and criminal litigation, look at the number of under trials who are languishing in our prisons. And so therefore, that is exactly what I was talking about, that we need 30 years in order to set our country straight. And one of the things that is central to setting our country straight is setting our judicial system in order. Spending enough money in order to augment both the physical and the intellectual resource of our judicial system. If you go down to some of the tehsil courts, the infrastructure is absolutely abysmal. That's not the way a judicial system should be functioning. And therefore, on education, on health, on our judicial system, we require a far greater outlay in terms of our GDP than what we are possibly able to prescribe. And even and the most scandalous part of it is that we are not even able to fill up the vacancies which exist. Our high courts are functioning at half the strength. Collegium decisions are not actioned. Collegiums are not able to arrive at a consensus with regard to decision making. So therefore, in fact, I am of the view that the NJAC paradigm needs to be relooked at, and the NJAC in some form needs to be reinstated. The collegium system, unfortunately, with great respect to the judiciary, has not been able to deliver. And so therefore, if in a country you have to actually pass a judicial order that you can rehire retired judges in order to deal with pendency, while you have 50% vacancies, I mean, what kind of a system are we really talking about? So there has to be a fundamental overhaul, and this whole business of judges judging themselves, this goes against the very essence of the doctrine of separation of powers. And so therefore, some kind of a check and balance needs to be put into place. Judicial confirmations, like in the US, through a Senate committee, maybe give it to a Rajya Sabha select committee in order to do the vetting, and for the Rajya Sabha then to confirm the appointment of judges. So therefore, there is a lot of reform which unfortunately needs to take place, because you see, it's very interesting. I'm sorry if I'm being a little long-winded, but when India went into the coalition phase from 1991 onwards, and the center seemed to weaken, the judiciary stepped into that vacuum. And unfortunately, in 2014, when you had a majority government at the center, the commentary on the independence of the judiciary in the past 7 years is all there before us. You just have to read the newspapers on a daily basis. It actually makes you extremely shameful to even contemplate as to where we have reached. So India's judicial system requires a surgery, and it requires a drastic surgery to be able to deliver on the fundamental tenet for which it has been created, that is, giving quick and speedy justice to the people.
Thank you very much. Perhaps, we are coming towards the end of the session, but I'll pose one question relevant to the theme of today's conversation. Probably this could be the last question. If you compare law and policy, one is normative standards which show the right ways of living, and the other a guidance to move forward, a motivation to move forward, a commitment, a guarantee to the people. Which one gives hope for the people of India, especially under the present circumstances in which we live?
Well, I think there has to be a balance. You see, there has to be enlightened policy making, and there has to be robust judicial oversight. You see, it's really the balance of the two which brings out the best for the people. So when you have enlightened policy making, which takes the concerns of 135 crore people who live in India on board, and then you have a humane, compassionate judiciary, which then arbitrates in a just manner and gets its priorities right. I mean, unfortunately, some of the cases in the docket during the last 1 year in the Supreme Court, when a pandemic was raging and there were large number of constitutional matters pending, could really have waited. So I think it's the balance between an enlightened government which makes correct policy, and a fiercely independent judiciary which has compassion at the core of its philosophy of jurisprudence. That is the not the best. That's the only way forward for this country, or any country for that matter.
Thank you, Mr. Tewari, for your elegant musings. I must say that this was a very enlightening session. You touched the contemporary realities using a theoretical framework. So on behalf of the Jindal Global Law School, on behalf of OP Jindal Global University, and on behalf of CUTS, I extend my heartfelt thanks to you. Over to Professor Rajkumar.
Well, thank you very much for that really comprehensive tour de force on the historical evolution of the idea of inclusive growth and what kind of a society that we need to build. I was very particularly intrigued to hear your China narrative, because I had the privilege to work in Hong Kong for many years, and I've traveled across China. And one of the less talked about aspects of Chinese context is the significant investment in education and health in the early part of that evolution. And at that time, those investments were made, and clearly China began to benefit from that investment at least a few decades later. Even Professor Amartya Sen in his book Development as Freedom, but also in other narratives, this has been emphasized. So I think I was particularly inspired by the fact that you touched on that, and then of course to bringing it into current realities of how we ought to govern ourselves, and instead of we need to recognize the priorities that are needed when it comes to policy implementation, and education and health ought to become the two critical areas in which a lot of our attention, including policy and governance attention, need to be made. So once again, thank you very much, Mr. Manish Tewari, for your fascinating keynote address. I deeply appreciate the fact that you took time out on a very busy day and indeed very difficult times. And I appreciate your participation in this conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Rajkumar, for having me. Thank you very much. And thank you. And everybody who's watching this, please stay safe. Please stay careful.